Millionaire hides his wife from a party out of shame. He never imagined that his photo would go viral on social media. And Frank Mitchell, one of Miami's most respected businessmen, was renowned for his relentless ambition and strategic acumen. Married to Julia Thompson, a graceful and cultured woman, he had built a life that appeared flawless to outsiders. Yet, those who observed more closely could discern that something was amiss. Frank deliberately avoided introducing Julia at important social events, not out of a protective instinct or jealousy, but because he was ashamed of her modest background. Julia, who had grown up in a humble neighborhood of Springfield, had always been grateful for her achievements. A literature graduate with a passion for poetry and the simple joys of life, she carried herself with an elegance and natural intelligence that often surprised those who met her. Despite her many virtues, Frank saw her as a mirror of the parts of himself he wished to erase, his own modest roots. To stand beside Julia at a gala, in his mind, was to expose a vulnerability he could not afford. At first, Julia believed Frank's absences were small sacrifices made for her comfort. "Those parties aren't your scene, my love. They're full of pretense and people obsessed with status," he would say, pressing a calculatedly tender kiss to her forehead. But over time, she began to notice a pattern. With each invitation, he found another excuse for her to stay home. One morning, as they sipped coffee in the meticulously decorated kitchen of their mansion, Frank casually mentioned an upcoming gala hosted by a powerful investor. "Another one of those dreadful events," he muttered, taking a sip from his cup. "You'd feel out of place, Julia. Better to stay home this time." Julia glanced up from the newspaper she was reading, a faint tightness gripping her chest. She wanted to challenge him, but she held her tongue, knowing he would counter with an unassailable argument. As Frank folded his paper and headed to his study, satisfaction etched on his face, Julia remained seated, staring at her untouched coffee. She understood that his discomfort wasn't hers, it was his own insecurities. He feared the whispers, the judgmental glances, and the potential blow to his prestige that her presence might provoke. As Frank busied himself with preparations for the evening, Julia found herself unsettled by the familiar refrain. A nagging frustration bubbled within her as she contemplated the isolation her husband had imposed upon her. She didn't doubt that he loved her, but his actions betrayed something deeper, a need to control the narrative of their lives, even at the cost of excluding her from it. When the evening arrived, Frank, meticulously dressed in his tuxedo, every detail fine-tuned to project the image of a self-made success. Julia watched from a distance, seated in the corner of the expansive living room. "You look very handsome," she remarked softly, masking the discomfort stirring inside her. "Thank you," Frank replied flatly, adjusting his cufflinks in the mirror. "Don't worry, it won't be an interesting night." The moment Frank departed, Julia was left alone in the vast emptiness of the house. She tried to lose herself in a book, but the words blurred on the page. She brewed a cup of tea and settled by the window, gazing out at the distant city lights. An aching hollowness enveloped her, and her thoughts drifted toward the life she was living, a life spent in the shadows. Why did Frank feel the need to hide her? Julia knew it wasn't a lack of affection, but the wounded pride of a man desperate to conform to a world that prized appearances over substance. As the hours passed, a quiet determination began to stir within her. Something had to change. Though she didn't yet know how or when, she was certain of one thing. Her voice would no longer remain silent. It would first reach Frank, and then the world. The grand event hall of the Oreo Hotel, one of Miami's most luxurious venues, glittered beneath the imposing chandeliers. The air hummed with sophistication as guests in elegant attire moved about, waitstaff weaving through the crowd with trays of champagne. It was a night Frank Mitchell had anticipated eagerly, though not without a trace of unease. Arriving alone wasn't uncommon for him, but it wasn't ideal either. He knew the glances would come, followed by the inevitable questions. As he crossed the threshold of the grand entrance, Frank was immediately intercepted by the host, a prominent American investor renowned for spotlighting the city's most influential figures. "Frank, what a pleasure to see you. Where's your wife tonight?" The host's polished smile was unwavering. Without hesitation, Frank delivered the excuse he had honed to perfection. "Julia prefers to avoid events like these. She finds them a bit superficial." The host nodded politely, though the flicker of curiosity in his eyes betrayed some doubt. Navigating the room with calculated charm, Frank exchanged greetings with familiar faces and offered measured compliments. Yet his composure wavered slightly when his gaze fell on a striking figure across the room. Rachel Stevens, Miami's most formidable socialite, was impossible to overlook. Draped in a stunning red gown that caught the light at every angle, Rachel exuded an aura of power and intrigue. Known for her sharp wit and even sharper maneuvering in both business and society, she approached Frank with the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "Frank," she said, her voice smooth as she cradled a glass of red wine, a sly smile curving her lips. "You finally graced us with your presence. I was beginning to think you'd forgotten how the social game is played." Frank responded with a practiced laugh, though the unease stirred within him. "Work keeps me busy, as you know, but here I am paying my respects to our gracious host." Rachel tilted her head slightly, her dark eyes fixed on him with a piercing intensity that seemed to strip away pretense. "And Julia? I don't believe I've ever seen her at one of these soirees. You must keep her well hidden." The jab was unmistakable, but Frank maintained his composure. "She prefers the peace of home, Rachel. You understand, not everyone is built for this sort of atmosphere." Her perfectly arched brow lifted in mock surprise, though her expression betrayed amusement rather than belief. "Curious," she mused, swirling her wine, "because the whispers around the room suggest otherwise. They say, you avoid bringing her. You know how people love to talk." Frank felt the sting of her words. His throat tightened, but he masked it with a sip of champagne. "People do talk too much," he said, his tone steady but clipped. "Perhaps because they have nothing better to do." The firmness in his response hinted at the growing tension beneath his polished exterior. Meanwhile, scattered clusters of guests exchanged murmurs across the hall. Julia's absence was far from unnoticed, and speculation buzzed like static in the air. "Do you think they're having issues? Maybe she doesn't fit in. He rarely mentions her. It's peculiar." Though Frank couldn't hear their words, he felt their weight. Every prolonged glance seemed to question. Every fleeting smile seemed laced with judgment. Sensing the pressure mounting, Rachel shifted her approach, though not without delivering one final barb. "In any case, Frank, I'm not here to critique your personal choices. In fact, I came to discuss business." She took a step closer, lowering her voice to an intimate pitch. "I have a proposition that could be mutually beneficial, but of course I need assurances. You know how it is. Image is everything in our world." Her words carried a pointed undertone. The subtext was clear. His personal life, or at least its public perception, wasn't just gossip fodder. It was a liability that could ripple into his professional sphere. Frank smiled faintly, though the tension in his jaw betrayed the effort it took to maintain his mask. "Let's discuss this in my office next week. I think we'll find it more productive without distractions." Rachel inclined her head, her satisfaction evident. She had sown the seeds of both intrigue and leverage. As Frank turned to walk away, the exhaustion of the evening began to settle over him. The carefully maintained facade felt heavier with every passing moment, its cracks threatening to show. The party carried on, but Frank's mind was elsewhere. Thoughts of Julia and the choices he had made to keep her at a distance began to creep into the edges of his consciousness. For the first time that evening, he couldn't shake the feeling that his actions might cost him more than he was willing to pay. If you're watching this far, I'm sure you're enjoying it, so I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel. Julia sat in the armchair of the living room, enveloped by the deafening silence of the mansion. Frank's absence that evening was a familiar void, yet one that never failed to unsettle her. She gazed out of the large window overlooking the illuminated garden, her thoughts drifting to the question that had gnawed at her for years. Why did he keep her away from such significant events? For a long time, she had accepted his explanations, convinced that Frank was shielding her from the superficiality of those gatherings. But now, an uneasy doubt had begun to take shape. Was it protection or shame? Rising slowly, she walked to a bookshelf that housed a collection of old photo albums. She selected one and returned to the armchair, allowing herself to sink into the memories held within the photographs. The first page revealed snapshots of her graduation in literature, surrounded by her family and friends in Springfield. Life had been simple then, but full of meaning. The smiles were genuine, the conversations long and heartfelt, and the freedom unrestrained, a freedom that now felt like a distant memory. Turning the pages, she came across images from the early days of her relationship with Frank. The trips, the extravagant gifts, and the elegant dinners had seemed like something out of a fairy tale. But as she studied the photos more closely, a pattern emerged, one she had failed to notice before. Frank always chose secluded settings, moments away from crowds or anyone who might question their origins. The realization hit her like a cold gust of wind. Had he, from the very beginning, been trying to mold her to fit into his world while concealing the parts of her he deemed unsuitable? With a heavy sigh, Julia closed the album, feeling a tightening in her chest. She needed to know what was happening at the gala. Hesitating briefly, she picked up her phone and opened her rarely used social media accounts. In the search bar, she typed the name of the event. Instantly, photos and videos flooded her screen. There was Frank, immaculate in his tuxedo, mingling effortlessly with Miami's elite. He smiled, relaxed, a version of him she barely recognized. As she scrolled through the posts, a knot formed in her stomach. The comments praised his charm and presence, but not one mentioned her absence. It was as if she were invisible, an entity erased from his public life. That silence was deafening, and for the first time, something inside her fractured. Why had she allowed herself to be erased in this way? Why had she let him dictate how much of her could participate in his life? The sound of footsteps pulled her from her thoughts. Rose, the housemaid, entered the room with a dishcloth in hand. "Are you all right, Mrs. Julia?" she asked, noting the distant expression on her face. Julia hesitated, but then answered honestly, "I don't think I am, Rose. I'm starting to feel like I don't belong in this life anymore." Rose, a woman of straightforward wisdom and a generous heart, stepped closer. "You have more strength than you think, ma'am. Maybe it's time to show the world who you really are, not for anyone else, but for yourself." Her words struck a chord. Julia offered a faint smile in thanks, and once Rose left the room, she reopened her phone. She scrolled through her photos and paused on a simple portrait of herself taken months ago, a moment when her happiness had felt genuine. She uploaded the image to Instagram with a caption that felt like a whisper of rebellion. Sometimes, being invisible is more exhausting than standing out. Hitting post, she felt the weight of her decisions settle over her. She put the phone aside, unsure of what response, if any, her message would receive. But the quiet didn't last long. Notifications began to pour in, one after another. "Are you okay, Julia? What a powerful sentiment. We need to talk. You're incredible. Don't let anyone dim your light." Each comment was a spark of support, unexpected but deeply warming. Julia looked at her phone, now buzzing with life, as though it had become a connection to a world she'd forgotten existed. Minutes passed before the phone vibrated incessantly. A message appeared from Clara, an old university friend. "You were never invisible to me, Julia. I miss you. I hope you're okay." Other names soon followed. "Julia, what a poignant post. You're stronger than you think. Maybe it's time to be seen. Don't you agree?" She stared at the names, friends she hadn't spoken to in years, and felt a strange, bittersweet warmth. These were voices from her past, now resonating in her solitude, as though they had found her in the void where she had been lost for so long. Rose returned moments later, carrying a tray with tea. "Your phone's been quite busy tonight," she teased lightly. Then, seeing Julia's expression, her tone grew serious. "Did something happen?" Julia smiled faintly, still processing. "I think my post got more attention than I ever expected." Rose leaned in to glimpse the screen, curiosity gleaming in her eyes. "See? People care about you, Mrs. Julia. Maybe it's time for you to care about yourself too." The words struck deep. Julia realized that perhaps it truly was time to take control of her own story. Her voice, stifled for so long by Frank's expectations and the confines of their life together, was finally starting to emerge. Far away, in the opulent ballroom of the Aureo Hotel, Frank remained immersed in strategic conversations. Oblivious to the undercurrents swirling miles away, he toasted glasses of champagne, his focus on potential investors and influential figures. He smiled for cameras and carefully maintained his image of success, unaware that a storm was quietly brewing, its seeds planted in the solitude of his own home. Back in the living room, Julia read through the comments on her post. Alongside the messages of concern were expressions of curiosity, discreet questions tinged with worry. "Julia, are you okay? It seems like you have something important to say." Others were bolder. "You've never been the type to hide. If you need us, we're here." Julia was startled by how deeply the words touched her. Names she hadn't thought of in years appeared, old friends now offering a connection she didn't realize she needed. Rose glanced at the screen with approval. "See? You're more important than you think. Maybe it's time to remind yourself of that." Julia nodded, the strength of Rose's words settling within her. For the first time in years, Julia felt the stirrings of something she thought she had lost, a determination to reclaim her voice and her identity. She wasn't sure what lay ahead, but she knew it was time to begin writing her own story. It was both a relief and a challenge to finally express herself. Julia wondered just how far she was willing to go. As the night wore on, notifications continued to pour in. One message in particular caught her attention. It was from Anna Parker, a friend from high school. "Julia, your caption struck a chord with me. I know what it feels like to live without being seen. If you want to talk, I'm here." Julia felt tears prick her eyes. It wasn't just her. Her story was resonating with others. This wasn't simply about invisibility. It was a silent burden many women carried. Determined to take the next step, she picked up her phone again, this time to write something more personal and direct. "Sometimes we need to scream to be heard. Thank you to everyone who is listening. Maybe this is the start of something new." As soon as she hit post, a sense of liberation swept over her. It felt like she had taken the first step on a path she could barely see, but one she was finally ready to follow. The morning started as usual for Frank Mitchell, though the events of the previous night lingered in his mind. He was at his office in the hotel, reviewing documents from the gala, when the first message arrived. It was from a colleague who had attended the event. Attached was a screenshot, along with a brief note. "Have you seen this? It's making the rounds." Frank opened the attachment, and his heart raced. It was Julia's photo, paired with the caption that felt like a challenge. Sometimes being invisible is more exhausting than standing out. For a moment, Frank stared at the screen, struggling to gauge the gravity of the situation. More messages started flooding in, comments and forwarded links from others who had seen the post circulating. Frustrated, he threw his phone onto the desk and ran a hand over his face. What was Julia thinking? How could she expose something so private? Still fuming, Frank grabbed his car keys and drove home in a rush. As soon as he entered the house, his voice echoed through the halls. "Julia!" he shouted. She appeared in the corridor, startled by his abrupt arrival. "Frank, what happened? Why are you here at this hour?" He held up his phone, his expression seething with anger. "You know exactly why I'm here." Julia froze for a moment, her gaze falling on the phone in his hand. Then it clicked. He had seen her post. Despite an initial pang of discomfort, she steeled herself. "If you came here to argue about my photo, don't waste your energy. I won't apologize for expressing how I feel." "Expressing how you feel." Frank's voice rose, his frustration spilling over. "Do you have any idea the damage this could cause? Everyone is talking about it. My colleagues, my business partners, they're all seeing this as an attack on me." Julia raised her eyebrows, caught off guard by his self-centered response. "An attack on you? And what about me, Frank? Have you ever stopped to think about what it feels like to be treated like a ghost in your life?" The argument escalated quickly. Frank, usually composed and adept at controlling every narrative, found himself at a loss against Julia's conviction. He scrambled for justifications, but his words felt hollow even to himself. "I do this to protect you, Julia, to keep you from uncomfortable situations." "Not protect me?" Julia repeated, a sharp laugh escaping her lips. "Don't be a hypocrite, Frank. You're not protecting me. You're hiding me. You're ashamed of who I am, of where I come from, and that has nothing to do with me. It's about you, your fear of not seeming perfect." The silence that followed was heavy. Frank felt her words strike like blows, each one exposing truths he had long buried. Struggling to regain control, he softened his tone. "Look, you're overreacting. This post will blow over in a few days. Let's not make this bigger than it is." Julia shook her head, disappointment etched into her features. "You still don't get it, do you? This isn't about the post. It's about years of silence, years of being invisible next to the man I love." She stepped closer, meeting his gaze with unwavering determination. "I'm done living like this, Frank. I'm tired." For the first time, Frank saw something in her eyes he had never seen before, an unshakable resolve. He felt the grip he had on her slipping through his fingers. Even so, he tried one last time to downplay the situation. "We'll fix this. People will forget. Just stop posting things like that." Julia gave him a long, calm look, her voice steady but firm. "This isn't about them, Frank. It's about me, and I've started to find myself, whether you like it or not." Turning away, she climbed the stairs, leaving Frank standing alone in the vast living room. Meanwhile, Julia's post continued to gain traction on social media, gathering an unexpected momentum. Over the next few days, messages of support flooded in, especially from women who saw their own struggles reflected in her words. One morning, while scrolling through the comments on her post, Julia's phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. She hesitated before answering, her curiosity piqued. "Mrs. Julia Thompson, my name is Robert Smith, a journalist with the Miami Times. I've been following the reaction to your post and was wondering if you'd be willing to do an interview. I believe your story could inspire many people." Caught off guard, Julia stammered, "I'm not sure if it's appropriate. This wasn't something I planned. I understand, but I think this could be an opportunity to fully share your voice. Thousands of people are engaging with your message. Why not tell your story in your own words?" Robert's tone was gentle but persistent. Julia thanked him and promised to think about it, though the idea lingered in her mind throughout the day. Later, while Rose served lunch, Julia shared the proposal. "What do you think, Rose? Should I accept?" Rose, ever practical and candid, replied, "If this is your chance to be heard, why not take it? This isn't just about you anymore. It seems like a lot of people see themselves in your story. Maybe it's time to show them they're not alone." Rose's words resonated deeply, and the next day Julia called Robert to accept the interview. When they met at a quiet cafe, Julia was visibly nervous. She had chosen a discreet location to avoid drawing unnecessary attention. Robert, professional and empathetic, guided the conversation carefully. Julia spoke about the isolation she had endured in her marriage, the weight of being treated like a secret, and the inner battle she had fought to reclaim her identity. With each word, she felt herself growing stronger, taking yet another step toward the freedom she craved. Days later, the interview was published on the Miami Times website under the title, "The Voice That Broke the Silence: Julia Thompson's Journey to Visibility." The article quickly went viral, particularly among groups of women who shared similar experiences. The comments flooded Julia's social media, praising her courage and urging her to continue sharing her story. For the first time, she felt like she had something valuable to contribute to the world. Meanwhile, Frank was beginning to grasp the magnitude of what was happening. He could no longer ignore the messages and the curious glances from those around him. During a meeting at the office, a colleague joked, "Seems like your wife is more popular than all of us combined, Frank." He forced a smile, but inside, he was seething. As soon as he got home, he sought out Julia, his frustration barely contained. "We need to talk. Don't you see the damage this is causing? It's spiraling out of control," he said, his voice tense. Julia, however, was not the same woman he was used to. She listened calmly, waiting until he finished, and then replied with a quiet yet unyielding resolve. "What's spiraling out of control, Frank, is your belief that you can silence me. I'm done living in fear of how things might look for you. For the first time in years, I'm speaking for myself, and this won't stop." Elsewhere in Miami, Rachel Stevens sat at her desk, reading the article about Julia on her tablet. A sly smile spread across her face as she considered the possibilities. Julia's story was the perfect opportunity to expose a vulnerability in Frank, a weakness Rachel could exploit to her advantage. She picked up her phone and made a brief call, her voice measured and confident. The wheels of a plan were beginning to turn, though its full form had yet to take shape in her mind. Julia sat in the kitchen, sharing a quiet cup of coffee with Rose, when her phone buzzed with a new notification. It was a direct message on Instagram from someone named Kimberly Adams. Curious, she opened it and was greeted by the profile picture of a poised, authoritative woman, middle-aged, formally dressed, with a serious expression. The message was brief, but carried weight. "Julia, I'm Kimberly Adams, a human rights attorney. I've been following your story, and I believe it has the power to create real change. I'd like to invite you to speak at a women's empowerment event, where your voice would be most welcome." Julia set the phone down on the table, her thoughts racing as she tried to process the invitation. Rose noticed her silence and leaned closer. "Everything all right, Mrs. Julia?" Julia inhaled deeply, still uncertain. "It's a well-known lawyer. She wants me to speak at an event." Rose crossed her arms, her face breaking into an encouraging smile. "And why not? You're already sharing your story. This is just a bigger stage." Despite Rose's reassurance, Julia felt hesitant. Speaking publicly about her life felt like an enormous challenge, something she had never imagined herself doing. But at the same time, the idea tugged at her. It was as if each step forward pulled her further from the control Frank had wielded over her for so long. After hours of reflection, Julia made her decision and replied to the message. Kimberly, thank you for the invitation. I accept. Let me know how I can help. The next day, Kimberly arranged a video call to discuss the event in detail. Her voice was warm yet commanding, instilling both comfort and confidence. Julia, women from all walks of life will be there, sharing their experiences and eager to hear yours. I know it's intimidating, but your story could give strength to so many. During their conversation, Kimberly offered to help Julia prepare her speech, a gesture that bolstered her confidence. By the end of the call, Julia was convinced she had made the right choice. Meanwhile, Frank was beginning to feel the full weight of the situation. Each new step Julia took felt like an erosion of the control he had worked so hard to maintain. When he learned of her invitation to the event, he wasted no time confronting her. That evening, he waited for her to retreat to their room. Finding her poring over notes Kimberly had sent, he approached her with thinly veiled concern. Julia, are you sure this is a good idea? He asked, his voice carefully measured. These things can backfire. People aren't always kind when a story goes too public. Julia looked up, instantly recognizing his strategy. Frank, I know what I'm doing, and I'm not going to stop. He stepped closer, shifting tactics. I just want to protect you, my love. I don't want you to get hurt. But Julia had no intention of falling into that trap. Protect me? Or are you just trying to protect yourself? The tension in the room was palpable. For the first time, Frank realized his words no longer carried the same weight they once did. He attempted to push further, but Julia cut him off decisively. This is my decision, Frank. You'll have to accept it. In the days that followed, preparing for the event became a transformative experience for Julia. With Kimberly's guidance, she began shaping her narrative, not just focusing on the struggles she had faced, but highlighting the strength she had discovered within herself. Rose, ever loyal and supportive, took care of the practical details, ensuring Julia had everything she needed. You're going to shine, Mrs. Julia, Rose said with a proud smile. And it's not just for you, it's for all of us. Meanwhile, Frank found himself increasingly unsettled. Not only was his position as the dominant figure in their marriage slipping away, but he was also coming to terms with the fact that Julia was becoming someone he could no longer mold. Each step she took seemed to solidify her independence, leaving him more adrift than ever. Rachel Stevens, watching the situation unfold from a distance, viewed it all with an almost predatory interest. For her, Julia's rise wasn't just a threat to the fragile stability Frank was desperately trying to preserve, it was an opportunity. Rachel had always been a master manipulator, and as she saw Frank growing more vulnerable, she decided it was time to act. Over a private lunch with Charles, a mutual acquaintance of hers and Frank's, Rachel casually steered the conversation toward Julia. Sipping her wine, she spoke in a tone that was light, but laced with purpose. Did you know Frank came to me months ago asking for advice about his wife? She began. Charles raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Really? Oh, yes, Rachel continued with a sly smile. He was worried about her stepping into the public eye, said she didn't have the presence for certain circles. She paused, letting the words sink in. Charles chuckled awkwardly, but Rachel wasn't finished. I told him it was best to keep her out of sight, of course. But look at us now. Who would have thought she'd become an icon for empowerment? Her voice dripped with irony, her words calculated. Though the comment was shared in confidence, it quickly reached Julia through someone else present at the lunch, a mutual acquaintance who didn't hesitate to send Julia a detailed message recounting the exchange. When Julia read the account, it felt like the ground had been pulled out from beneath her. This wasn't just about Frank's shame. It was about the deliberate lengths he had gone to in keeping her in the shadows. He had lied, manipulated, and, worst of all, enlisted others in his efforts to erase her from his public life. Julia spent the entire night wrestling with the revelation, reading and rereading the message as silent tears rolled down her cheeks. Every word felt like a dagger, cutting deeper into her already frayed trust. By morning, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, she went downstairs to make coffee. Rose, ever perceptive, noticed her somber demeanor immediately. "Are you all right, Mrs. Julia?" Rose asked gently. Julia hesitated before confiding. "Rose, everything I suspected about Frank, it's worse, so much worse." At the same time, Rachel moved forward with the next phase of her plan. During a meeting with Frank, she chose her words carefully, sowing doubt with precision. "Frank, have you considered the impact all this is having on your reputation?" she asked, her tone sympathetic yet deliberate. "Maybe it's time to distance yourself publicly from Julia. Not in a dramatic way, of course, but something that reaffirms you're still in control." Frank, already overwhelmed by recent events, mulled over her suggestion. He didn't want to tarnish his carefully curated image, and Julia's growing presence now felt more like a liability than an asset. But Rachel underestimated Julia's resolve. One evening, Frank left his phone unlocked on the table, and Julia happened to see a string of messages exchanged between him and Rachel. What she discovered confirmed her worst fears. Frank had not only actively kept her out of his world, but was now contemplating a public separation to protect his reputation. Shock gave way to a smoldering anger. Julia decided she would no longer remain silent. If Frank and Rachel were willing to use her as a pawn for their own agendas, she would use the very tool that had given her power, her voice. The day of the Women's Empowerment event arrived, and Julia was resolute. She had made the decision to tell her story in full, not just about Frank, but also about the insidious alliance he had formed with Rachel. With Kimberly and Rose by her side, Julia prepared herself emotionally and strategically, knowing that this speech would be the ultimate turning point in her life. Frank, who had tried every tactic to dissuade her, now lived in fear of what she might reveal. Rachel, on the other hand, remained confident that no matter the outcome, she would find a way to leverage the situation to her advantage. When Julia stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. The audience, filled with women who resonated with her story, waited in anticipation. She took a deep breath and began. "For too long, I was kept in the shadows. Not because I lacked something to offer, but because it was convenient for someone else. Today, I want to share the truth, not just mine, but the truth of many women who have been silenced." Her voice was steady, her conviction unmistakable. She continued, her words piercing the silence. "I want you to understand what it feels like to be erased, to live in someone's shadow while screaming inside for your own voice to be heard." Kimberly watched from the wings, pride lighting her face as Julia's confidence grew. "Keep going," she had told Julia during their rehearsals. "Don't be afraid to show your vulnerabilities. That's where your strength lies." As Julia's speech took shape, Kimberly's team had already been working tirelessly to amplify the event's message online. Short, powerful videos with phrases like "Don't mistake silence for acceptance" and "Every story matters" circulated widely, accompanied by testimonials and snippets of Julia's journey. The hashtag #HearJulia became a trending topic, drawing not just supporters, but also critics and the curious. Amid the whirlwind of preparation, a new challenge emerged. Julia received a call from a mutual acquaintance of Rachel. "Julia, I thought you should know. Rachel is planning something. I heard she's trying to discredit you at the event, maybe by exposing something from your past or twisting the situation with Frank." Initially shaken, Julia quickly found resolve. "If Rachel wants to attack me," she told Kimberly, "it's only more proof that I'm doing the right thing. I'm not backing down." Meanwhile, Rose, always watchful and perceptive, decided it was time to reveal something she had long kept to herself. As she helped Julia prepare for the event, she cleared her throat nervously. "Mrs. Julia, can I tell you something? Something I think you should know about everything that's happened." Julia paused and turned toward her, intrigued. "Of course, Rose. What is it?" Rose hesitated before continuing. "From the start of your marriage, I saw things that made me uncomfortable. Do you remember when you started working on that editing project? Frank interfered behind your back. He told your boss it would be better if you focused on other priorities. I should have spoken up then, but he asked me not to get involved." Julia felt a lump form in her throat. This wasn't just control, it was sabotage. "Thank you for telling me, Rose. I need to know these things because now it's my turn to speak." With a renewed sense of purpose, Julia threw herself into perfecting her speech. Every word was deliberate, every sentence charged with meaning and emotion. She worked closely with Kimberly, ensuring her story would not only expose her truth, but resonate with the experiences of countless women who had faced similar struggles. The night before the event, Julia gathered everything she needed and stood before the mirror. As she stared at her reflection, she marveled at how much she had changed. The woman staring back at her was no longer silent, no longer complicit in her own erasure. "This time they'll hear me," she whispered, her eyes gleaming with determination. Frank, desperate to regain control, decided to try a softer approach. He waited for Julia in the living room, dressed casually to appear unassuming, his demeanor rehearsed to convey calmness. When Julia entered carrying her neatly organized speech notes, he stood and offered her a smile. "Julia, can we talk? I promise I just want to listen." She hesitated, then sat down opposite him. "What is it, Frank?" she asked, her tone weary but measured. He leaned forward, feigning sincerity. "I know you've felt ignored. I know I've made mistakes. But everything I did thinking about what was best for us." Julia's gaze remained fixed, her expression unflinching. "Best for you, Frank," she corrected. He raised his hands in a placating gesture. "Fine, maybe I was selfish, but I want to change. I want to be the husband you deserve." From his pocket, he pulled out a small jewelry box, opening it to reveal an elegant necklace. "I got this for you, a symbol of what we could rebuild." Julia glanced at the necklace before returning her gaze to Frank, her voice steady but firm. "Do you really think a necklace can undo years of control and manipulation? This isn't about material things, Frank. It's about respect, and respect isn't something you can buy." Frank tried again, desperation creeping into his tone. "Julia, I don't want to lose you. I know this event is important to you, but do we really have to air everything publicly? Can't we fix this between us? Start over?" Julia stood, her speech notes clutched tightly in her hand. "Fixing this between us, Frank, would mean silencing myself again, and I won't do that. Not this time." As Frank grappled with the failure of his latest attempt to manipulate her, Rachel began to distance herself. Over a private lunch with an influential investor, she casually remarked, "Frank is in a precarious position. I don't want to get dragged into it. Maybe it's time to reconsider certain alliances." She knew her association with Frank was no longer advantageous and had already begun calculating her next move to protect her own interests. Realizing he couldn't stop Julia from attending the event, Frank shifted tactics. If he couldn't control the narrative, he would at least try to spin it in his favor. He called his advisor and arranged to attend the event himself, ensuring the press would know he was there. Julia, meanwhile, remained focused. As she stood backstage, waiting to take the microphone, she felt the weight of everything she had endured, but also the power of everything she had reclaimed. This was her moment, and she would not be silenced. Julia learned about Frank's plans at the end of the day when Kimberly approached her with the update. "He's going to be there," Kimberly said as they finalized the last details of the speech. "He's trying to turn this into a spectacle for himself." Julia's smile was resolute. "Let him try. I know exactly what I'm going to say, and nothing is going to silence me. Not anymore." With Kimberly's unwavering support, Julia stood firm in her decision to take the stage. The days leading up to the event were filled with rehearsals, each line of her speech sharpened to precision. Every sentence was crafted to communicate her truth, leaving no room for manipulation or doubt. On the morning of the event, Julia stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the final touches to her outfit. Rose, watching her with a warm smile, spoke gently. "Today is your day, Mrs. Julia. You deserve everything good that is coming your way." Julia took Rose's hand for a moment, her voice steady and sincere. "I finally feel ready. It's time to face this." Frank, on the other hand, was preparing for the event with a growing sense of urgency. He knew his control was slipping, yet he still believed he could somehow turn things around. Deep down, though, he recognized that Julia was no longer the same woman he had once manipulated. This new version of her was beyond his reach. The day of the event arrived, and the Mitchell mansion buzzed with an air of expectancy. For Julia, it wasn't just the day to tell her story. It was the day she would reveal to the world and to herself who she truly was. For the first time in years, she felt no fear. She felt powerful. With Rose's help, Julia underwent a transformation that morning. Sitting at her vanity in the expansive suite, she let Rose adjust every detail of her appearance. She wore a striking white dress, symbolizing a new beginning, and her hair, usually tied back pragmatically, now fell in soft waves that framed her confident face. As Rose stepped back to admire her work, she said, "Mrs. Julia, I've never seen you like this before. You're radiant." Julia smiled at her reflection. "It's because, for the first time, I'm ready to be myself." Meanwhile, Kimberly Adams sat with Julia, meticulously reviewing the speech they had worked on tirelessly. Bathed in natural light from the large windows, Kimberly read sections aloud while Julia made final adjustments. "Julia," Kimberly said, her tone encouraging, "every word in this speech is yours. Don't forget that. It's not about being perfect. It's about being real." Julia nodded, taking a deep breath. Every word she would say carried the weight of her journey. She knew this wasn't just her story. It was the story of countless women who had been silenced. Online, the campaign supporting Julia gained unstoppable momentum. Hashtags like #HearJulia and Invisible Voices trended across the internet. Kimberly's team released short clips of Julia rehearsing, accompanied by phrases such as, "Courage starts from within," and "Your voice matters." Messages of support flooded social media, with people sharing their own stories and commending Julia's bravery. Across the city, Rachel Stevens watched with a mixture of envy and frustration. Julia, whom she had once dismissed as insignificant, had become a force too powerful to ignore. Determined to sabotage the event's success, Rachel began making discreet phone calls. She contacted influential individuals, planting seeds of doubt by suggesting that Julia's presence might harm their reputations. She even attempted to spread rumors that Julia's speech would be a direct attack on Miami's elite. But despite her efforts, the movement around Julia had grown too large to be derailed. On the morning of the event, the venue buzzed with activity. Journalists and influencers arrived, eager to cover what was being dubbed the Day of Courage. News vans lined the streets as photographers set up their equipment. Anticipation filled the air, not just for Julia's speech, but for the broader impact it might have in a world where women still faced invisible barriers. Julia arrived at the venue accompanied by Kimberly. As she stepped out of the car, camera flashes lit up the air. She walked with quiet confidence, her calm smile exuding both strength and serenity. Every gaze and every lens was fixed on her. But this time, the attention didn't feel like a burden. It felt like an honor. Backstage, as Julia prepared to take the podium, Kimberly adjusted the microphone one last time. Remember, Julia, this isn't just about you. You're speaking for everyone who hasn't found their voice yet. Julia squeezed Kimberly's hand in gratitude. Thank you. This means everything to me. The auditorium was packed, and Julia stood at the center of the stage, facing the audience with a composure she could barely have imagined months earlier. Her speech unfolded with precision and emotion, each word resonating deeply. But backstage, Rachel Stevens, ever calculating, watched as if plotting her next move. She knew Julia was gaining strength with every sentence, and she realized she had to act quickly to shift the narrative. Rachel discreetly pulled out her phone and sent a message to a journalist known for sensational stories. Rumors of Frank Mitchell's involvement in financial irregularities, suspicious contracts in his hotel chain. Investigate. She knew that planting this seed at the right moment would draw attention away from Julia and create chaos for Frank, deflecting focus from her own involvement. Minutes later, phones throughout the audience began to buzz. Notifications lit up screens, and a ripple of whispers spread through the crowd. People leaned toward one another, showing messages and headlines. Frank, seated in one of the front rows, noticed the disturbance and quickly checked his own phone. His face turned pale as he read the headline, "Businessman Frank Mitchell under investigation, fraudulent contracts in hotel network." Frank felt a tightening in his chest. He knew that if the audience began associating him with scandal, his presence at the event would become untenable. He scanned the room, trying to gauge the reaction. Just a few rows behind him, Rachel watched with a small, satisfied smile. Her calculation had been precise. By exposing Frank, she not only diverted attention from Julia, but also began paving her own exit strategy, distancing herself from any fallout tied to the businessman's unraveling. Julia noticed the shift in the atmosphere. The scattered glances and hushed murmurs didn't escape her. But instead of faltering, she adjusted her tone, grounding herself in the purpose of her message. She would not let anything interrupt her resolve. Backstage, Rachel Stevens watched intently, realizing her plan had only partially succeeded. While the planted rumors had stirred a commotion, Julia held the audience's attention with her unwavering strength and authenticity. What Rachel hadn't anticipated was how her sabotage of Frank's reputation would highlight Julia's courage even more, contrasting starkly with his unraveling. Julia stood in the spotlight, her gaze sweeping over the silent audience. The microphone in her hand felt heavy, not from the physical weight, but from the years of silence and invisibility it symbolized. She drew a deep breath, steadying her racing heart, and began. "Good evening," she said, her voice steady yet laden with emotion. "I'm here tonight to share something I've kept hidden for too long. For years, I lived my life in the shadows." Her opening words were simple but struck deeply. She looked around, her eyes meeting those of attentive, curious, and even tearful faces. She continued, "When I got married, I thought I had found not just a partner, but someone who would support me, who would help me grow. Instead, I found myself in a cage, built with small lies, manipulations, and above all, invisibility." Her voice wavered for a moment, but she gripped the microphone tighter, regaining control. "I was kept as a secret, as if who I am wasn't enough." The room fell into an almost reverent silence, every word landing with palpable impact. Julia paused, letting her truth sink in before she spoke again. "I'm not here just to tell my story. I'm here because I know there are other women facing the same thing, women who live under the weight of being erased by those who claim to love them. This isn't love. This is control. This is a misuse of power. The energy in the auditorium shifted, the emotions swelling like a wave. Some audience members discreetly wiped away tears, while others nodded in silent agreement, recognizing a truth they had felt but never voiced. Julia pressed on, connecting her personal struggle to the collective experience. When we stay silent, we feed the cycle of invisibility that traps us. But I'm here to say, we can break it. We can speak, we can resist, and we can rediscover who we are, even if it means leaving behind those who try to dim our light. The power of her words was undeniable. At the back of the room, Frank felt his stomach churn. He realized that Julia's speech wasn't just an indictment of him. It was a reflection of the judgment in every pair of eyes turned toward the stage. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, trying to maintain composure, but the tension in his body betrayed him. Remaining there felt like standing defenseless in front of a firing squad. Julia's voice rose with conviction as she neared the heart of her message. Tonight, I want to dedicate this moment to all the women who still feel trapped, who still believe they need to conform to someone else's expectations. You are enough. You have always been enough. The audience erupted into applause, a wave of emotion surging through the room. The sound filled the auditorium, breaking through the weight of her words like a release. Julia stood still, allowing the applause to wash over her. A small smile graced her lips as she waited for the crowd to quiet before delivering her final lines. My story isn't unique, but tonight it is my voice, and I promise I will never allow it to be silenced again. As she stepped away from the microphone, the audience rose to their feet. The ovation was thunderous, punctuated by murmurs of admiration and expressions of gratitude. Julia glanced toward the wings and saw Kimberly beaming with pride. Next to her, Rose wiped tears from her cheeks, her emotion unhidden. Frank couldn't bear it any longer. The weight of Julia's words, coupled with the silent condemnation of the crowd, became unbearable. He stood abruptly, adjusted his suit, and walked out of the auditorium without looking back. For him, this was the moment of his undoing, the point at which everything he had built began to crumble. In the corridors outside, journalists and influencers were already preparing their analyses and reactions. Headlines were being drafted. Julia Thompson, the new voice of women's empowerment. Others highlighted the event's emotional impact. From applause to tears, Julia Thompson's speech on freedom captivates. The ripple effects were immediate, and Julia's image was quickly solidifying as a symbol of resilience and resistance. Though the event had ended, the intensity of the night lingered both inside and beyond the auditorium. Julia barely made it off the stage before she was surrounded by reporters and supporters. Camera flashes lit the air as journalists bombarded her with questions about her speech, her story, and her plans moving forward. At the same time, women from the audience approached her, many visibly moved, to thank her for her courage. Julia, you've become a symbol for so many of us, one woman said, holding Julia's hand tightly. Thank you for showing us we can be heard. Julia smiled warmly, overwhelmed with gratitude and a newfound sense of responsibility. She answered their questions patiently, each word carrying the weight of her promise to herself and others. But the moment of triumph was abruptly interrupted. A familiar figure emerged from the crowd, cutting through the sea of reporters and onlookers. Frank Mitchell, his face tight with frustration and his gaze dark with resentment, pushed his way toward her. His presence caused a stir, and the cameras immediately turned in his direction. Julia, he called, his voice sharp and edged with bitterness. We need to talk. Julia, though momentarily surprised by Frank's sudden appearance, maintained her composure. Frank, she said, her tone calm yet unyielding, I believe everything that needed to be said has already been said. Frank, however, refused to retreat. You exaggerated, Julia. You twisted the truth to make yourself the victim. That's not how things happened, he retorted, his voice tinged with both frustration and deflection. The tension in the room thickened. People nearby began murmuring, and cameras shifted into position, eager to capture every second of the confrontation. Julia inhaled deeply, gathering her resolve. "Exaggerate, Frank," she asked, her voice sharp with precision. "Shall we talk about exaggerations? Or should we discuss how you isolated me, manipulated situations to keep me dependent, and lied to preserve your spotless image?" Before Frank could muster a response, Julia reached into her coat pocket and pulled out an envelope she had carried all evening. "Since you insist, let me show you something." She opened it, revealing copies of emails and messages, irrefutable evidence of how Frank had sabotaged her opportunities in the past, from her career as an editor to invitations he had deliberately hidden to keep her out of social circles. "These," she said, her voice ringing with clarity, "are proof. Proof of the lies, the control, and the manipulation you call protection. The truth is right here, Frank, and it will no longer stay hidden." The crowd fell silent, the only sound coming from the relentless clicks of cameras capturing every moment. Frank opened his mouth to respond, but faltered. His words dissolved before they could take shape. Before he could recover, another figure stepped forward, her presence adding a new layer to the drama. Rachel Stevens, who had been observing from the sidelines, decided it was time to protect herself. Striding toward a group of reporters, she handed a folder to one of them. "You might want to take a look at this," Rachel said smoothly. "It contains documents showing financial irregularities in Frank Mitchell's business dealings, fraudulent contracts, kickbacks, things the public has a right to know." The revelation hit like a thunderclap. Reporters tore into the documents, their expressions quickly turning to shock as they uncovered details of bribery, shady agreements, and outright corruption. Rachel, with a calculated smile, turned to Frank. "Transparency, Frank. I told you it was important. Seems like now is the perfect time for it." The news spread like wildfire. Social media erupted as live streams from the event began broadcasting the scandal in real time. Both Frank's and Julia's names trended instantly, but for entirely different reasons. For Frank, the humiliation was unbearable. He glanced around, seeing not only the scrutinizing eyes of reporters, but also the silent condemnation etched into the faces of those present. Bereft of allies and with his reputation in tatters, he turned on his heel and stormed out, the flashes of cameras capturing every step of his retreat. Julia, however, stood her ground. The attention shifted back to her, not as the invisible woman who had once lived in Frank's shadow, but as someone who had reclaimed her voice and her power. Journalists crowded her, asking for her reaction to the revelations. With measured calm, she replied, "Today isn't about the downfall of one person. It's about the strength of women rising. It's about refusing to stay silent in the face of injustice." The crowd erupted in applause, the sound washing over Julia like a wave of vindication. As she stood there, a rare sense of peace settled over her, a peace she hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just a personal victory, it was a message to everyone who had ever been silenced. Frank had fallen, but she had risen. In the days following the event, Julia experienced a whirlwind of emotions. She was exhausted, yet relieved. For the first time in years, her voice had been heard, and the chains of control that had bound her were gone. Social media continued to buzz with messages of support, and several organizations reached out to her with collaboration proposals. One, a foundation focused on empowering women, invited her to share her story at a future event. Julia eagerly accepted the opportunity. Standing before women who needed to hear that there was life beyond pain became more than an invitation, it became a mission. At the event, as she scanned the room filled with eager faces, she realized the profound impact her journey could have. "I'm not an expert," she said honestly, "but I know what it means to fight to stand again. And I'm here to tell you that pain doesn't define who we are. We are so much more." The experience ignited an idea in Julia's mind. She wanted to do something bigger, something beyond sharing her own story. She wanted to create a space where other women could find support. One afternoon, while sitting with Kimberly in a cafe, she voiced her thoughts. "Kimberly, I want to start an NGO. I want to help women who, like me, need a place to rise." Kimberly, always pragmatic but equally passionate, was silent for a moment before her eyes lit up. "Julia, that's incredible, and I'd love to help. My work as a lawyer has always been about giving a voice to the voiceless, and I think we can build something extraordinary together." Their partnership was sealed with a handshake and a shared smile, symbolizing a commitment to a shared purpose. The process of building the NGO was challenging, but Julia had never felt more alive. Kimberly handled the legal aspects while Julia reached out to contacts and began gathering stories from women who wanted to collaborate. Rose, her steadfast ally, managed the logistics for their first meetings, ensuring every detail was in place. They eventually named the organization Renaissance, symbolizing the rebirth and empowerment of every woman who walked through its doors. Simultaneously, Julia explored new professional opportunities. Invitations for conferences and collaborations poured in from across the country, and she accepted several, seeing each as a chance to showcase not just her story, but her strength, knowledge, and capability. Slowly, she uncovered passions she had never pursued before, including writing about her experiences. Articles turned into the beginnings of a book, a project that promised to extend her voice even further. What had started as her personal struggle was now transforming into something much greater. Julia had risen, and in her rise, she was lifting others with her. With her life transforming, Julia decided it was also time to change her surroundings. Miami, a city filled with both cherished and painful memories, no longer represented the future she envisioned. After much reflection, she chose New Orleans, a place renowned for its quiet beauty and welcoming energy. Rose, loyal as ever, insisted on accompanying her, and together they began planning the move. On the day Julia arrived at her new home, she felt a profound peace she hadn't experienced in years. The house was simple but charming, with colorful walls and a small garden that seemed to promise renewal. She glanced at Rose, who was unpacking suitcases with her characteristic care, and smiled. "You know, Rose, I never thought I'd be in charge of my own story one day, but now I feel like I can do anything." Rose's eyes glistened as she replied, "You deserve all of this and more, Mrs. Julia, and I know this is only the beginning of many accomplishments." Meanwhile, Frank Mitchell sat alone in a modest rental apartment, a far cry from the luxurious properties he once called home. The sparse decor and worn furniture starkly contrasted with the opulence that had once defined his life. The echoes of scandal and damning headlines still lingered in his mind, and he knew his name, once synonymous with success and influence, now evoked manipulation and corruption. Staring into the emptiness for hours, Frank grappled with how he had arrived at this point. His mind replayed every decision, each choice born from vanity and pride. His need to control Julia, the shame he felt about his humble origins, and the lies he told to preserve his image, now appeared not just as mistakes, but as grotesque inevitabilities for the man he had been. At last, he admitted what had seemed impossible before. He had ruined not only his marriage and reputation, but also his humanity. That night, Frank reached for a sheet of paper and began to write. It was a letter to Julia, though he knew it wasn't meant for reconciliation. He had no expectations of forgiveness or answers. Instead, he needed to unburden himself of the guilt that gnawed at his soul. "Julia," he wrote in trembling script, "throughout our life together, I was a broken mirror, reflecting only what I thought I should be and never what I truly was. My shame and pride blinded me, and in the process, I erased you, the only person who truly mattered. There are no words to undo what I did, but I hope you find peace in knowing I recognize my failures and admire deeply the person you've become. Thank you for showing me what true strength looks like." When he finished, Frank felt a small but undeniable weight lift from his shoulders. He sealed the envelope and placed it on the table, knowing Julia might never read it, but that he had needed to write it to begin moving forward. Beaucoup de Senos a few days later in New Orleans, Rose handed Julia the envelope over breakfast in the sunny garden. "Mrs. Julia, this arrived today. It seems to be from Mr. Frank." Julia stared at the envelope, a mix of surprise and curiosity washing over her. She held it carefully, hesitating before opening it. As she read Frank's words, she felt a pang in her chest, not of pain, but of compassion. He seemed sincere, but she knew that nothing he could say would change the past. She tucked the letter into a drawer, alongside other remnants of a past that still touched her, but no longer defined her. Julia didn't feel anger, only a serene acceptance that allowed her to see Frank not as a villain, but as a lesson. "I've moved on," she whispered to herself, feeling a sense of closure settle over her. Meanwhile, Rachel Stevens was fading into obscurity. The fallout from Frank's scandals had tarnished her reputation, and rumors swirled about her struggles to maintain her once powerful connections. Without the glimmer of her former status, Rachel became a forgotten figure, a symbol of selfish choices and their inevitable consequences. That afternoon, Julia strolled through the streets of New Orleans. The cobblestone paths and vibrant houses exuded warmth and life, mirroring her new chapter. She paused at a small square where local musicians played gentle melodies and children laughed beneath the shade of ancient oaks. Taking a seat on a bench, she watched the scene unfold with a peaceful smile. As she gazed at the bright blue sky, Julia felt an overwhelming sense of freedom she hadn't known in years. Her life had changed drastically, and while the scars of the past remained, they no longer weighed her down. They were now marks of growth, reminders of a story that had shaped her into the woman she had become. In that moment, Julia realized her greatest achievement wasn't just freeing herself from Frank or the control he had wielded. It was discovering her own strength and purpose. She closed her eyes, letting the soft breeze caress her face, and smiled to herself. For the first time in a long while, there were no shadows on her horizon.